Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Toby Newstead. I'm a leadership scholar at the University of Tasmania, here today with Dr. Joey Crawford, who is also a leadership scholar at the University of Tasmania, and we are your hosts for Talking Leadership Development. Talking Leadership Development is an initiative that is powered by the Menzies Foundation in partnership with the University of Tasmania, and our aim with this webinar series is to lift leadership development, research and practice in Australia and beyond. Before we go any further today, I would like to pause to acknowledge the lands from which we join you today. We join you today from Lutruwita, Tasmania, which are the lands and the waterways of the Palawa and Pakana people. We're speaking about leadership today, and when we are speaking about leadership, it's really important to note that there have been peoples on these lands practicing leadership and culture for millennia, and indeed people practicing leadership and culture on lands all over the world for millennia. I pay my deep and sincere respects to the traditional and continuing custodians of the lands from which I join you, and I invite you all to call to mind and to heart the lands and the traditional custodians of the lands from which you join us. So, the origin and intent of talking leadership development. Leadership is a pretty big deal. There is a booming leadership industry, and leadership development is something that we spend literally billions of dollars on every year. Many of us here today, myself included, are wrapped up in this industry. We literally, our day jobs are about understanding leadership development and trying to enable leaders to practice the kind of leadership we require to address and work through the problems that we currently face, both locally and globally. And despite the huge size and the huge amount of investment that goes into the leadership development industry, and despite the fact that we understand the importance of leadership, we still are faced by a number of challenges to our efforts to develop leaders and leadership. And these challenges include very micro issues, such as things within us as individuals, like how do we actually develop individual strengths, skills, and abilities? How do we know if we've developed individual strengths, skills, and abilities? To the more sort of meso type challenges that happen, when we start thinking about how do we actually enable leaders to go about facilitating effective teamwork or to go about facilitating effective collective sense making. And then, of course, there's the very sort of macro challenges such as gender equality and social justice and climate crisis. So there are many challenges to leaders and to our efforts to developing leadership, which means that today we have a lot to talk about, because today the focus of our webinar is on the key challenges and opportunities in developing leadership. To come at this topic today, we're going to hear from four awesome panelists, and what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce our four panelists in the order in which they're going to speak, and once I've introduced all four, then I'll pass the mic over and we'll hear from each panelist in turn as they share their thoughts with us in relation to the biggest challenges and or opportunities they see in developing leadership today. So the first panelist we will hear from today is Professor Michelle Ryan. Michelle is a world-renowned gender equality expert. She is Professor of Social and Organizational Psychology and the inaugural director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Her work centers on understanding the psychological processes underlying workplace gender inequality and designing and implementing innovative and evidence-based interventions to increase gender equality. Michelle brings with her a vast and nuanced understanding of the individual and collective identities and phenomena that can either help or hinder efforts to develop leadership in general and leadership for gender equality in particular. Now, little side note, if you've ever heard of the glass cliff phenomenon, which I've definitely written about in some of my stuff, and I think it's kind of a big deal that Michelle is the author of that theory, which I think is pretty cool. Welcome, Michelle. Michelle will be first. After Michelle, we're going to hear from Dr. Tomas Remenyi. And Tom is a climate scientist. He has delivered more than 50 projects across a range of sectors, including natural hazards, emergency services, tourism, energy, and agriculture. As a systems thinker, Tom is always trying to figure out what the blockers are to positive change within society across multiple sectors. Over the last few years, Tom has been working with leaders and leadership development practitioners to grapple with the role of leadership in addressing the many and complex problems associated with climate crisis. Following Tom, we will hear from Sara Redman. Sara has been a leadership and culture coach and consultant for over 20 years. She lives and works in Tasmania and has a special interest in well-being. As fellow Canadian-born Tasmanians, Sara and I have known each other personally and professionally for many years now, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her insights today, which will likely, I feel, help us glimpse the very real and very personal challenges involved in developing leadership today. And then lastly, and absolutely not leastly, we will hear from Professor David Day. Now, if you have ever dipped into the academic literature on leadership development, you've likely come across David's name and some of his work. He is one of the most influential leadership development scholars and was just recognized by the International Leadership Association with a Lifetime Achievement Award. David is Professor of Psychological Science and Leadership, and he is Academic Director of the Kravis Leadership Institute at Claremont McKenna College in California, USA. He'll contribute a very comprehensive view of the state of leadership development science and research to our conversation today, and especially in relation to the known challenges and opportunities we face in developing leaders and leadership. So those are our panelists, absolutely phenomenal lineup. And what I will do now, without further ado, is pass over to our first panelist, Professor Michelle Ryan.
Thank you so much, Toby, and to you and the rest of the team for organising this wonderful webinar. It's really wonderful to be part of it. Just to acknowledge that I'm joining from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra. So then in terms of challenges and opportunities, I might just sort of dive straight into it. So where I'm coming from is from the perspective of gender equality and workplace gender equality. And for me, I think leadership development plays a really big part in how we achieve gender equality, but it is both a challenge and I think an opportunity. So for me, I think the first thing that people often think about when they think about leadership development in the sort of realm of gender equality is thinking about the underrepresentation of women in leadership roles. The fact that, you know, women really are often not in top roles, in influential positions, taking on those leadership perspectives. And that's one of the sort of big take-home figures when it comes to gender equality in the workplace. So the solution often is to that underrepresentation to dive straight into leadership development and really look at things like leadership development courses for women. So often cohorts just made up of women, teaching them skills and strategies and abilities. Now, what I would say is while everyone can absolutely benefit from learning new skills and strategies and developing their leadership, I don't necessarily think it's the first step that we should take when we think of the problem of the underrepresentation of women in leadership. So what's implied in this as a sort of approach is that there's something wrong about women, there's some sort of deficit, that they lack skills and abilities, and if we just fix that, then we'll fix the representation problem. And for me, it's just not that simple. And for me, that approach really puts both the onus for change on women, and it also potentially puts the blame for gender inequality on women as well. So for me, I think we need different solutions. And I think this is where the opportunity part comes up. So I actually think when it comes to workplace gender equality and the underrepresentation of women, the underlying cause is not a lack of skills in women, but rather it's systemic inequalities and culture, you know, different types of culture in the workplace that disadvantage women. And what we need to do to achieve change is actually to change those things. We need to change our cultures, and we need to do that in a real way of through leadership, I guess. So this is where the opportunity comes in. So I would see the opportunity for leadership development in the gender equality space not to be developing women as leaders, but to be developing the skills of all leaders to really understand what change is needed when it comes to gender equality, how to change culture, and really doing that from the top. So we know that leaders have a big influence on the culture of organizations, and that might be through formal aspects of the organization, that might be through policy and practice and the way in which they lead, but it also might be very informally because they often set the tone and set the way in which interactions happen as well. So for me, I think leadership development can really happen, and I'm really happy to talk about this a little bit more as we go forwards, but leadership development in the gender equality space really should be equipping all leaders, not just women, with the skills needed to affect change. So I might just leave it at that, and I'm happy to expand on those things as we go forwards. Thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. I love that idea of developing the skills of all leaders in order to make the systemic and cultural changes required to achieve gender equality. That's, I think, a really important message. And you get double points because you identified a challenge and an opportunity. So thank you so much. Tom, can we hear from you now?
Thanks, Toby. Thanks for warming everybody up, Michelle. So yeah, as a climate scientist, one of the biggest challenges I've seen in leadership over the last decade, and it's really an emerging challenge right now, is that people have we've got a lot of really activated individuals who have put a lot of effort into training themselves up into how they can take action, but stepping into how they can then work at the systems level and coordinate across a large network of other people that are trying to take action is really challenging. And that's a real gap, I think, in a lot of the leadership development material that's out there, and also the mechanisms that we deliver. So if you're trying to teach people how to collaborate, then actually one of the key challenges is that you need to get them to be collaborating in order to practice that, not just doing it one-on-one in a workshop context or in a didactic situation like this. And so that's sort of, I think, one of the key biggest challenges moving in for us moving to solve the poly crisis. We've got huge, big challenges that are way bigger than one person can take on by themselves, and how we can sort of train people on how to best engage with that to have real impact in where they put their energy and effort is, I think, a really, really big gap. Now, of course, that also means that there's this huge opportunity, because if there's a gap, it's also something that's also quite capable for us to fill. And as I mentioned, we also have a growing number of people that are more activated in this space and really trying to take action to solve these big challenges. Many of them are on this call. And so being able to get them to have a greater awareness of this gap means that it's actually quite easy for them to go, oh, well, I'll put a bit of effort over there and do that. But we just need to be able to spread that knowledge out through the networks, out through our networks, to say this is a core challenge. As you can imagine, with leadership and climate change, there's quite a lot of things that I've often have to overcome. And one of the other ones that I've really noticed, and it's kind of related to this particular issue, is that there are a lot of people out there that don't consider themselves leaders, and therefore don't invest in training themselves on how to be a better leader. They're not the ones that put their hand up and say, yes, I'd like to do that extra course, or the ones that go, yeah, I really need to understand what being a director of a business actually means, because that's not what drives them. They aren't the ones that want to be in charge. They're not the ones who want to be the figurehead. They might have the vision, they might have the skills, but they just don't want to take that on. And I think that's a really big gap, a really big challenge for us in leadership development and diversity, is that we actually have a huge number of people that don't feel like they are allowed to be in that particular role, because they're not the big noisy person who loves being on stage in front of everybody, such as myself. And so I think that's a real challenge that we need to overcome. And I'm not quite sure how to deal with that, because that's not my problem. I don't have a problem of not wanting to step up or not wanting to be on stage. And a lot of the leaders that go into this role don't have that level of awareness of how these other people feel. And we need to be able to figure out ways to bring them in. In the interests of also sort of keeping to a short amount of time so we can get into discussion, I'll then hand over.
Thank you so much, Tom, and some really, really interesting points there. I think another sort of comment around this individual collective nexus, we're working on developing individual leaders, which is great, it needs to happen, but really what we're trying to do is enable them to address these things that will only be addressed if they're truly collaborating, and I hope will we'll come back to that idea of identifying as a leader, because we happen to have on the call some experts in leader identity and other theories and approaches to understanding both individual and collective identity. So let's earmark that and come back to it. Thank you. Sara, can we hear from you?
Thanks, Toby, and thanks, Michelle and Tom, for getting us rolling. It's great to be here and have this conversation. So for me, the things that I thought of right away when I was asked this question around the challenges and opportunities in leadership development, well, first came to mind this whole issue of bandwidth. So bandwidth is a word that I hear a lot and have in the last few years, but really before that. And I mean, this sense of not having the mental, emotional, or even apply. And of course, from a leadership, only be present if we attend a leadership course or a coaching session or a group facilitation, if we don't have the bandwidth. And we certainly can't learn well or go away and apply our learnings, which are all essential components of effective leadership development. And we know that our world is busy. We know we have lots going on. The priorities are out of control. This notion of leadership now is never about knowing everything and knowing what to do. It's more about making sure we can ask the right questions and navigate our way through the complexity, the weeds that we're faced with on a daily basis, and get clear on priorities. So this challenge of bandwidth, which comes from a number of different things, it is really a big issue. And I face it every single day with the leaders that I work with, both individually and in teams, because then there's, of course, a team issue with bandwidth where people haven't had enough time to work together as a leadership team, or have gone away and done individual development and learning, but not come back together and collaborated, taking Tom's point. Change fatigue also leads to this as well, which pretty well every client I'm working with suffers from that at some stage. So that notion of bandwidth, and I don't have all the answers, but there are some things that we can do about it, and I will talk about an opportunity around that. The other challenge I want to raise today is actually, might feel a bit left field, but is around this emerging challenge of menopause and its impact on female leaders and organizations generally. I don't have the stat in front of me, I'm sorry, but I know it's a staggering number of women will be entering into menopause in the next 3 to 5 years around the globe. And there are many, many more women in significant leadership positions now, and leadership positions at all levels of organizations in the community. And this is predicted to have a massive economic impact, as well as, of course, a leadership impact. And I think we really need to look at how we can understand this better and get ahead. We know with things like burnout that, yes, there's things you can do to treat that. You can take time, you can take space, you can do things to recover, you can step down from a leadership position for a period of time, then come back to it. We know with mental health, which obviously contributes to burnout and all sorts of things as well, there are actual things we can do about it. And there's less of a stigma around it now, since the global pandemic has caused this burgeoning issue with mental health. And fortunately, the good thing out of that is leaders and organizations are understanding what this is, and that we need to do positive things to support that, and we need to openly talk about this. But I think menopause is potentially the next global pandemic, or maybe leadership disruption, that we really do need to start talking about and start putting on the table. It's actually quite devastating, the impacts that women go through, and it's only now the science is starting to help us understand this. The medical sort of backgrounds, the medical focus, on this is starting to happen finally. But I do think we need to really look at how we can deal with this, because it's not like burnout. It's not like mental health. It's not a treatment as such yet, and it's complex. It's not something we can eat well, sleep well, and meditate our way out of. So I wanted to put that on the table. And in terms of the opportunity here, and there's always opportunities, but I think one key opportunity is to focus on, as leaders and teams, organizations, like the top of the organization, to doggedly focus on how we can create more space for our leaders individually to check in with themselves, to take care of themselves, but to also strategically reflect and do what they need to do as leaders, to apply their development and learning. If we don't have that space to reflect, we can't do that. But also the teams. I know one of the biggest challenges I have with my clients, they all understand the value of leadership development. They all want to do it and create space for it. So there's not an issue with the rationale behind it. The issue is with holding and keeping that space. The number of times I've had workshops, coaching sessions that have had to be rescheduled, sometimes several times, because of other priorities that emerge in the workplace in that day, that moment, which I get. but we need to make sure that we are focusing on a discipline where leaders and teams understand it's just as important for them to have space and time to develop together, to collaborate, to apply their learnings, as it is to deal with immediate priorities that come up in the workplace as well. So I could go on for a while, but I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sara. And I'm so happy that you raised the M word. I when I was last visiting David at the Kravis Institute, there was a conference we had, and I remember having a conversation with Barbara Kellerman, who's another sort of big player, very big player in the leadership industry, and we were talking about gender stuff. I had told her about a paper I was doing on barriers to women's leadership, and she said she was gobsmacked that people aren't taking more of a biological and physiological approach to understanding the impacts of everything from menstruating to childbirth to bearing children and then menopause in terms of the effects on women's experiences of leadership. So thank you for putting that on the table, and we'll see if our conversation comes back to that. But before then, David.
Hey, thank you, Toby. Thank you all, co-presenters. Thank you all for inviting me on this, it seems to be exclusive Australian adventure as the outside American. I'm hoping what I can offer is of some value. And as Toby mentioned at the top of the webinar, is that my perspective is mainly as an academic, and I come at this as someone who's spent the last couple of decades trying to elevate the scholarship behind leadership development. I'm not a practitioner per se, scientist practitioner maybe, but big S, small p. And I think there's a lot of room to grow and room to understand about what's the evidence, what's the science behind leadership development. Going forward, I think one of the biggest challenges is, as we know, the world is continually becoming increasingly complex. The kinds of problems that we're facing are increasingly complex, and yet the way that we offer solutions to these problems in the leadership development space doesn't match with what we know about human development. I think a big issue with that is this fixation on leadership development programs. And I'd spend a couple minutes talking about that before I turn things back over to Toby. Someone in higher education years ago told me something that has stuck with me, which was in talking about some of the challenges facing higher education and developing leaders in that educational space, whether they're MBA students, whether they're undergraduate students, is this notion that the world has problems, universities have departments. So when you think about departments, it's very fixed, functional perspective on what problems are. So when you think about it in the leadership space, the world has very complex adaptive challenges, and what we offer are programs. And programs are mismatched to the complex adaptive challenges that require leadership because they're primarily designed around closed systems. So if you think about what goes on in a typical leadership development program, is someone goes away somewhere to a different space. They may come into that space very motivated. They may learn things as part of that developmental program that transform them, and then they go back to their host organization and try to implement what they learned in the program. This is mismatched to human development because we know that sending a changed person back to an unchanged system is a recipe in futility. So what is an opportunity going forward? And that is to think about development more in systems terms. And by systems, I'm referring mainly to open systems theory. And open systems theory is really one in which there are cycles of events and repeated feedback loops where people will learn on the job or in their work and transform their thinking, their mindsets, or maybe some of their skills around leadership and development through development, and then apply those in the actual context in which they are working, get feedback about that. The feedback offers input into the next cycle of events. And what we're essentially leveraging is experience for development, ongoing experience for development, not experience that takes place in a special place where people develop away from their work. It's focusing on helping people develop while they do their work, including the mistakes that they'll make, learning from those mistakes, because we know that's a very powerful way to learn. And through these cycles over time, there is this kind of upward spiraling effect that is the onus of development as a leader or as leadership. So how can we do that? Well, I think one of the things is, and it goes back to something that Toby said at the top, which was, this whole leadership development industry. It's a huge market. Programs are the commodity in those markets. Programs are the things that are monetized. People have a lot of territoriality around their programs. So instead of buying programs, maybe we need to buy people who can help individuals think about developing and implementing their own bespoke developmental systems. Back to you, Toby.
Well, that sounds simple. We'll just do that. Thank you, David.
I guess the podcast is over, huh?
Yeah, the end. Thank you. And I think there, at least to my ear, there seem to be some sort of recurring themes that we're hearing here, especially around this intersection of individual and collective. The challenges, the problems that they're very much adaptive, which requires a collective effort, and still a lot of our programming, especially, is stuck at this individual thing. And when you're talking about those, the opportunity you see in shifting how we do development, David, I almost was hearing echoes of Sara's comments around needing space actually in and at work, as individual leaders and as teams of leaders to do the work, not just our outside of work coaching session or our weekend, human peer bits. David, will you share your gym and what is it? The gym and the carnival thing?
Yeah, the carnival amusement park. Yeah, thank you for that. The way most people think about leadership development is as a pass to an amusement park. You go to an amusement park, you go on all of these amazing rides, you have a lot of fun with your mates. It's an exhilarating day. You come away from it going, whoa, that was really great. But I'm done with that amusement park for the next year. And that's really the kind of program-focused approach to leader development. You're going to go somewhere, have a lot of fun, learn about yourself, be exhilarated, be transformed, come away, and then say, well, I'm done until the next program comes along. Instead of a ticket to an amusement park that focuses a lot on what some of my colleagues have called leadertainment, it's really more about the notion of buying a gym membership. And what we know about people who buy gym membership, mea culpa, you buy a gym membership and you don't use the gym. Or you buy a gym membership and you go to the gym and do anything but work out and sweat and actually develop yourself physically. The people who actually buy a gym membership, use a gym membership appropriately, do see results, but they're not immediate. And I think the way you need to think about development is not a ticket to an amusement park, but a membership to a gym. And the gym is all around you. It's your everyday life. The apparatus, or apparatuses, I'm not sure what the plural of apparatus is all of these things that happen to you as you are working. So trying things new in the moment on the job and getting feedback about it. Sometimes it won't go well, but that's a learning moment. And we know that that mistakes are really strong catalysts for learning, but you have to have the courage to try to implement things that you may not have perfected. And there may be good reasons that are obstacles to that. But if you're in a system that is supportive of people trying new things and tolerant of mistakes being made in the name of development, then I think some amazing things can happen from that, as opposed to sending people to the amusement park of leadership development once a year.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Right. What I would like to do now is to sort of pass over to our panelists in the first instance. So Michelle and Sara and Tom and David, and just open it up to the four of you to see if you have questions or comments or perhaps provocations for each other based on what you've shared, what you've heard. Sara.
Thanks. I'll just jump in. It's so interesting to hear what everyone had to say. David, I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying about, I love that amusement park gym analogy. It's fantastic. And that notion of bespoke development and of allowing people, well, getting people to have that lens or view that in their daily life they can develop very actively. And I didn't have the time to mention it, but I think it's relevant here to particularly your comments, David, about creating psychological safety in the workplace. So you can have space and time, as such, we'll call it time. But if we don't have the safety to have the kind of conversations that we need to have about the tough stuff, you know, the personal and professional, because they both cross over into how we operate as leaders individually and as a team, you don't really make a lot of traction, in my view. And this notion of psychological safety, not just that you feel that you won't be judged for speaking openly and honestly, but in fact, an extension of that, that it's essential and necessary to have your voice at the table. That's something that I'm working really hard with my clients on at the moment, because I think that if you create the time, because that's one of it, but then also create the landscape of that safe environment, then you are able to do those things like look for mistakes, share mistakes, learn from mistakes. That's how we get to innovation and creativity. But we have to change our mindset and feel a sense of permission around doing that as leaders. And then ultimately we need to lead that for the organization to change culturally. So I just wanted to add in that piece about psychological safety.
Yeah, thank you. Very important.
Let me just follow up on that. I mean, you're absolutely right. Psychological safety is this notion of feeling safe enough to take interpersonal risks with a group of people. And it's a cultural norm. But rather than getting caught up in it's got to be the norm of the entire organization, people can start developing psychological safety in their teams or in their department or in a smaller group, almost like a microclimate, if you would, rather than trying to change the entire culture of an organization, which we know is really hard to do and often doesn't work. But as a leader or someone in a leadership role, you can have a lot of effect by trying to change the smaller norms in your smaller group.
So David, are you suggesting that if the CEO says we're now a psychologically safe workplace, it doesn't magically make it so?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
only if they put it, but only if they put it on a poster.
Oh, right. Yes, if it's on a poster, it's done deal. Yeah, no, I think that is a really important comment, and in some ways, and I'm going to throw to Michelle because I think you're about to say something, Michelle. But I think that kind of links back to Tom's comment around people not identifying as a leader and not having a formal leadership position. We still probably have opportunities to do really important leadership work, like striving to create psychological safety in whatever teams or contexts we can. So I think there might be another link there to that identifying as a leader or not. And again, a link between individual and collective. But Michelle, I feel like you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I was sort of going to go off onto a different tact, if that's okay. And this was sort of a question for Thomas, but maybe for the panel more generally, because I think when Tom's talking, in my mind, I'm sort of also thinking like, who is a leader? What constitutes leadership and those sorts of things. And then especially when it comes to something like climate change, you can think about leadership playing itself out in really different ways, through formal and informal ways, through hierarchical and non-hierarchical, through activists and things like that. But then I guess more generally, for Sara and for David as well, what does that mean, and who seeks out leadership development, or who puts their hand up for it, or who is tapped on the shoulder for it? And are those necessarily the people, I don't know, one, that need the leadership development, or two, could actually have the greatest impact as influencers? So I guess that's sort of a provocation more generally for the panel.
So I'll go first. So I've witnessed leadership at every scale, like primary school kids getting out there doing things. They don't even know they're leaders yet. They don't even really understand what that means. All the way through to, Greta Thunberg is a fantastic example. But I don't think she ever felt like she was trying to be a leader. That sort of came afterwards. And then you've got people, leading large organizations that are actively saying, right, we're going to take this on, and we're going to start trying to do things differently to try and address the poly crisis within the wheelhouse that we have control. And I think the one thing I've seen over and over again, particularly in voluntary organizations, and of course I see a lot of them through the climate change space, but also in emergency management, is that there's a lot of people who just want to help, but they don't think that they're the one who should be in charge of deciding on strategy or in charge of the vision of the organization. But they have a lot of comments about how the strategy and the vision of the organization is wrong, or how the culture of the organization is not allowing other people to take action. And it's this kind of challenge that we have, and I think this sort of touches on the second part of the question, is in different cultures, and obviously we're in, almost everybody here is in an Australian culture, and then similarly sort of Anglo-Saxon culture, where the loud old white male is sort of the vision of who the leader is, and they often have gone about things in a particularly authoritarian way. And that's people don't see that actually there's this other kind of all these other elements of leadership. But our hierarchies also don't recognize that we need leaders doing all these other things at almost every scale. So in order to create an enabling environment and a safe environment, you need people who have those skills for a start, and they have to be then sort of the ones who are helping to organize the meetings and to coordinate things and setting the meetings up so that everybody doesn't even notice that they're the leader and they're the one in there actually creating the space, that facilitation role. And a lot of people don't know that that's a leadership skill, and that's a leadership element that needs to be done by people. So I think understanding just what leadership skills are out there, what they're used for, and who actually needs to have them are some of the key challenges of people who don't identify as leaders. When they don't go into Google and say, what are leadership skills I need? So I think that's a real challenge, and I think that's where we've got this hidden group of amazingly powerful leaders through our systems who are not empowered to actually implement those changes through our organizations.
Michelle, can I sort of put that back to you a little bit? Because I think you and Tom are both coming in with, expertise on certain issues that are quite big, and as you've both eloquently illustrated, only resolved through this more, collective capacity. So how do you see that playing out? Like, how do you know who needs to be developed at what levels and in what ways in order to help achieve the systems and culture change required to work towards gender equality?
Yeah, I think that I wasn't expecting to answer my own question. I was lobbing out difficult ones for other people. Yeah, no, I think so. For me, it's really interesting as someone who both studies leadership and then since taking on the role of director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, then having to sort of be a leader as well. For me, it was really interesting to sort of try and do leadership, and in doing so I set up the Institute from scratch, which was a great opportunity. But in doing so, I guess I got to do things like saying, well, what do I want the culture to be like? How am I going to situate my leadership amongst other people and those sorts of things? And I think for me, that process was really interesting. So one, setting it up from scratch, you're not going in there and fixing other people's problems, although you are doing it within a university system that has its own structures, within an academic sector which already has its own norms and stereotypes. So for me, actually having to work through that and see what that looks like, and then really to say, how are we going to set a culture? And my first decision really was, it's my responsibility, but it's not me who gets to decide what the culture is. So we tried to set up a real bottom-up thing about what people wanted and what they valued and what should we as a group work towards and what we should value and those sorts of things as well. So I think it is partly obviously the responsibility of a leader to do that, but it's not their sole decision making that determines it as well, or certainly not when it's done properly. The only other thing I would just add to this, and maybe this is just based on the book that I'm reading at the moment, I'm reading Rick Morton's book on robo-debt called Mean Streak, which is absolutely fascinating. I would just recommend it to anybody. And what's really interesting there is about massive failures of leadership, actually, and people that were perhaps in leadership roles that showed poor leadership, but then actually people like whistleblowers and people that at much more junior levels who are actually showing amazing leadership to come forward and call things out or identify problems and things like that. So that also really made me think about that leadership sometimes is about empowering people to make good decisions, but sometimes change or, you know, making good things happen is sometimes about disempowering people that probably have, you know, leaders that have too much power and aren't doing the right thing. I'm not sure whether that answers your question though.
Yeah,
just
fascinating ideas.
Can I follow up on that? Because I think I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing something here from Carolina about, you know, the business of leadership is everyone's. It can be practiced by everyone. And that's, you know, I'm in an undergraduate college now, and one of the biggest obstacles to students thinking about their development as leaders is like, well, I don't have a leadership role. Why should I be, you know, who am I to be thinking I should be preparing myself to be a leader, be a, you know, engage more effectively in leadership processes when I don't have that role. But you need to start preparing before you have the role. The other experiences I had, and this was Australian experiences. I taught at the University of Western Australia in the business school for nearly a decade and taught MBA students about leadership. And the thing that we know about Perth, that there's more engineers per capita in Perth, Western Australia than anywhere else in the world. And this is an interesting complement to the undergraduates who don't have a leadership role. Most of these MBA students and executive MBA students came up through the engineering ranks and then found themselves in a leadership role, and they have no bloody idea what to do. And they now are faced with a professional world where all of their problems are people problems. They're all adaptive challenges. And in some respects, then they're like, oh man, I got to work on this leadership stuff. And oh man, they're way behind the curve on this. So I'm a firm believer that there's a lot of power in informal leadership. We need to work with everyone and not just the high potentials, or not even just those who are in informal leadership roles, in order to create a broader, deeper capacity for leadership in our world, in our respective societies.
Yeah, I think there's been some stuff. I've only had a fraction of one eye casting over to the chat, but Joey has, and I think there might be some stuff around, you know, who leads and leadership, and perhaps even the intersection between leadership and management coming through. So I might throw to Joey to articulate that question or comment.
Yeah, and there's lots of questions coming up through the chat around the concept of this idea of a leadership team full of managers, and perhaps the idea that when you have big groups of leadership teams with people that aren't practicing good leadership or effective leadership, probably partly what Michelle was speaking to around robo-debt to a degree, not having read the book. But is there something that we can do about that as leadership development people, around empowering people to feel like they are leading, they can lead in a context where the concept of leadership is almost stolen away from frontline employees or people without formal roles of leadership? And Sara, maybe we go with you first.
Oh, I'm loving the conversation. And I think that's a great question. And I couldn't agree more that this notion of what leadership is so important. And one of the things I do with clients is redefine leadership, get them to come up with their own definition of what leadership is. There's some great stuff that you can find, like Drew Dudley did a TED Talk. It's really simple on everyday leadership about creating lollipop moments, he calls them, for people. But it basically, the tenet of it is that all of us can have leadership influence and do, but we may not even be conscious of it. And it's quite empowering when people start to open up their definition of leadership beyond a role title. And with managers and leaders, it's interesting, isn't there? Like, my view with that is there's a lot of overlap between the two, but very simplistically, and I'm not necessarily saying it's correct, but I do think leadership is much more about people, and management is much more about tasks and project management and output. And they both do that as well. But when I work with teams, and there is often that overlap of a manager in an organization really means a leader, and a leader might actually be a manager, which is interesting. So it gets quite messy. But I always will work with leaders around what leadership is and what it is for them, the impact they already have, because often we have blind spots if we are not aware, if we think we're just a manager, which is very simplistic view, but that's what people think sometimes. They may not realize the impact that they have as a leader in the organization. So I think for me, in a nutshell, it's about talking about it. It's about defining for that team, for that individual or the organization, and helping people open up their thinking and recognize it doesn't matter what you're actually doing. You all have leadership influence.
And Thomas, if I threw to you and you were commenting a little bit around people smart enough not to take on these leadership roles and lead from places without a role.
Yeah, so I think you see this all the time in the education system, where you look at what the role is of principals, assistant principals, and the additional overheads that they have to take on, and they are not paid for the additional time that comes with. But there's a lot of people who are like, I'm not going to step up and do that. I'm just going to do my job. And so I think we have a whole bunch of these problems where we're throwing so much into those roles in this hierarchical system that we don't have enough people and capability to actually take on those roles. So we're not actually resourcing those roles enough. And so the smart people don't take them on. And we've got that problem all through the university system. We've got a problem through some big corporates. They're often better at managing it because they have resources to realize that someone's not doing the roles, so they get somebody else in to assist. But I think in these sort of particularly resource-constrained organizations in hospitals, education, at all levels, we are putting too much into these management roles, and we're highlighting the importance of the management component without giving them any time to do leadership.
Well, and I see that sometimes we even call those, like expanding management positions. We'll sometimes even start calling them leadership, but definitely not giving the opportunity, the space for that leadership to occur, let alone the development that needs to go alongside that leadership for these roles, these people, these teams to have the impact that I think we desire. Yeah, Tom? Yeah,
and I think the best examples that I've seen of people getting into those roles and taking action in particularly the university sector were people that almost instantly said, I need someone in here to help me. And they resourced it, and they brought someone in and went, this is bigger than one role. And instantly the system started working better. Instantly everybody felt safer. Instantly everything was able to work because you had people in there who were actually capable of taking on the workload. And I think that's another part, I guess, of this whole sort of the hidden leaders and not really understanding is not realizing that that leadership does take time. You need to give it thought. You need to think about how am I going to lead this team, and you need to have that headspace to do that. Just like you need to have time to fill out the spreadsheet for this week's financial reporting. You need to have that time, and it's not often seen as an important role. It's seen as something that could just be done at people are just good at it, aren't they? It just happens. Whereas that's not the way it works. And I've even fallen into that space. So I think that's another element of this is that it's a very invisible skill. It's a very invisible role. And therefore it isn't necessarily given the time and attention it needs by anyone in the system, let alone the people that haven't even learnt really what leadership is yet. So I think that's where I come back to. So I had a couple of things there, Tom, that sort of stood out to me. And one was when you talked about hidden leaders and then leadership perhaps being some sort of invisible skill. And I wonder, and I'm sort of looking at David and Michelle here, what is it that we could be looking for that would help us identify, these hidden leaders or start to make visible some of these really essential leadership, knowledges, skills, abilities, capabilities?
Who's going to crack
Well,
first? David.
I was looking at Michelle and she wasn't going to crack. So I'll go. I mean, we have a developmental system at the Kravitz Leadership Institute. And again, it's for undergraduate students, but it's based on a set of first principles. And the first principle is that you cannot make anyone develop as a leader. You've got to own your development. So this notion of stepping up, if people aren't stepping up to want to develop to be better leaders, you need to do some systems diagnosis about why that's the case. I think in most organizations, people want to have agency. They want to have voice. They want to do the things that, fall under this guise of this fancy word called leadership. But if the people aren't stepping up, then what is the problem? And maybe they're just under the pump. There is too much going on that they feel that they can't take anything else on. It's a systems problem, in other words. And sending people who you identify, who you think have potential to lead, AKA the high potential employees, sending them to leadership development programs without their buy-in is just a waste of time and money.
I mean, the other thing, sorry.
I'll just very short, but there is also value in sending people that don't have that personal buy-in to learn about what it is. So then they might go, oh, that's what they wanted me to be doing. So I think there is a certain element of needing to expose people to things even though they're not ready for it, because then they actually at least know that it's there.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would add there is sometimes people say the person that puts their hand up for leadership is absolutely should not have leadership, right? So anyone that seeks out power is probably not going to wield it well. But I guess there's some other things there about, even just the process of identifying someone as high potential and things like that is pretty fraught within the system as well. So one, what does high potential look like? Are we just replicating our stereotypical notions of what leadership is and putting the same old people forwards? But also we've done some research on sort of succession planning that shows that by pointing out, this person has high potential, it actually has a really bad effect on the group as well, because you've suddenly tapped someone on the shoulder, left other people behind, and then all the cohesiveness and things like that you actually want is gone because you've identified people as being the next person forwards. And then maybe the final thing that I would just say is, what does good leadership look like and things like that I think partly it's like, it depends, right? It depends on the context. It depends on who's following. It depends on the situation. And I think part of the problem we often have is that not people in this room, but that in more generally, when we think about leadership, we think about, there's particular traits and that's what leadership looks like. But actually having this flexibility of what it should look like when and for whom is sort of really critical. And I think, we suddenly get what are the 12 traits of highly successful people, or what's the 5 things that you can do to be a good leader. I mean, a lot of it is about reading the room and understanding and responding accordingly, which that doesn't make for a very good book because you can't do a tick box list, but actually that's what really good leadership looks like on the ground, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's a bit disappointing because I feel like you're all saying there's no simple answers. And that's what we came here for. Just those 5 things we need to do to be an exceptional leader tomorrow. No, that is great. And I think we are hearing some very sort of different perspectives. And I do love that, Tom, you raised that. Like, yes, and when David, when you're talking about, thrusting people into these developmental opportunities when they're not ready or even resistant to them is, a recipe for, well, a waste of money and a failure, and can often then deter people from going for further development because it can be an unpleasant experience if people are trying to, thrust stuff on you. And it made me think of and I don't see this, like for my leadership scholar friends in the room, I don't see this enough in the leadership research I read around developmental readiness. And there's this idea that if we're not ready to develop as leaders, we're not going to develop as leaders. And if we are ready to develop, then whatever the opportunity is, be it an experience at work, a failure, or a program, or coaching, whatever it is, it's likely to have more effect and to result in better development because we're ready for it. And so I think that that can be a useful way to look at, you know, not tapping people on the shoulder. The high potential thing, I think, is fraught. And Michelle, you've outlined some really, I think I would like that research, because it can be so divisive in groups. If you know who the teacher's pet is and who's going to step up next, well, then there goes your motivation to look at stepping up, doesn't it? That sends such a strong and can not always positive message. But if we can look at what these factors of developmental readiness are and look at trying to facilitate them in our groups, then that might be an opportunity to, as you say, Tom, like prepare people and help Sara redefine what leadership might be for us as individuals and what these development opportunities may comprise of. And I feel like if that can sort of inform the groundwork we're doing, then perhaps our efforts to develop leaders and especially the collective leadership that is required to do the big jobs, you know, around climate crisis and gender equality and all the other, you know, very complex adaptive challenges we face. So I want to thank each of our panelists profusely. Thank you all for being here. Each of you has brought very unique and super well-informed and interesting, and for some of us challenging perspectives and ideas to this conversation around the key challenges and opportunities in leadership development. Thank you so much for coming, for being here, for sharing with us.